We start in South Africa, where the UK's Prime Minister Theresa May is on a charm offensive, seeking to boost trading ties between the continent and Britain. In her first visit to Africa since coming to power, she says she wanted the UK to overtake the US to become the G7's biggest investor in Africa by 2022. Well, she started her trip at a school in the city of Cape Town, where some of the children performed a dance for her before encouraging Mrs. May to join in. Her visit to South Africa is part of a 3-day trade mission, which will also see her visit Nigeria and Kenya. During her speech in Cape Town today, she pledged just over $5 billion in support for African economies to create jobs for young people. Our business correspondent Larry Madowo has been exploring what new British investment in Africa could mean for both sides.
Theresa May is ringing in a new era of British cooperation with Africa, the latest stop for her Brexit roadshow. To kick things off, a £4 billion investment in the continent's economies to create much-needed jobs.
So while we cannot compete with the economic might of some foreign governments investing in Africa, what we can offer is long-term investment of the very highest quality and breadth.
May is keen to recast Britain's relationship with Africa after the UK leaves the European Union as one driven by free markets and free trade. But African countries have increasingly more options. The European Union, with or without the UK, is still the biggest player in African trade. The latest figures show the overall number of exports and imports between the EU and Africa amounted to $305 billion. Next was China with $188 billion, followed by the US, whose total trade with the continent was valued at $53 billion. And at the bottom of the big four was the UK with a total of $36 billion. With this in mind, leaders like President Uhuru Kenyatta, who meets with May on Thursday, are shopping for deals everywhere.
We're not looking for Britain to assert herself on the African continent.
Trade-wise, for instance, investment.
We're looking for Britain. We're looking for Western Europe. We're looking for Eastern Europe. We're looking for China. We're looking for America.
Influential South Africa is the UK's largest trade partner in Africa, and the value of imports and exports exceeded $6.8 billion last year. Centerpiece for her announcement that the UK would carry over the EU's Economic Partnership Agreement with the South African Customs Union and Mozambique after Brexit. The Prime Minister is also visiting Nigeria, Britain's second largest trading partner in Africa, just a month after the French President Emmanuel Macron's high-profile trip there. Nigeria exports crude oil to the UK and imports back refined oil, electrical goods and industrial machinery. May is dancing to a new tune in Africa, but so is China, France and other global powers. Theresa May's three-nation tour is likely to be quickly forgotten because African leaders troop to Beijing next week for the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. That's just hot on the heels of President Xi Jinping's just concluded second tour of Africa. And the leaders will probably come back with goodies, more goodies than May can deliver. Larry Madowo, BBC News, Nairobi.
So Britain is looking to Africa for closer trading ties. Let's now talk to Razia Khan. She's a Botswana-born economist based here in London, where she is Standard Chartered Chief Economist for Africa. So Razia, Britain forging new ties or stronger ties with Africa, should they be taken seriously?
Absolutely. What we're seeing is the focus on re-energizing that trade relationship. In recent years, we had seen the UK as a whole possibly losing some of its share of sub-Saharan African trade. This was the case with a lot of developed regions, as Africa tended to trade more and see more trade growth with other emerging regions that were growing rapidly. Anything that's done to reinvigorate that relationship in terms of trade agreements, in terms of creating more certainty about what the future might look like, could have big dividends on both sides.
Well, we heard President Kenyatta Uhuru there saying they're not only looking, Africa's not only looking to Britain, but looking to France, Germany, and of course China, who's been investing heavily in the continent for the last decade and a half or so. Some would argue that Britain is coming a bit late to the party, sort of they've missed the bus.
Not necessarily. If we look at the historic stock of FDI, the UK is still a very significant investor in sub-Saharan Africa. And just today, we heard this pledge that there's absolutely the intent to ensure that the UK remains the most important of the G7 countries looking to the medium term.
But is it also ironic that she's making this trip to a 3-day trip to Africa just a week before African leaders will all be trooping to Beijing for a Sino-African summit, where, as Larry put in that report, they will be coming back with a lot more goodies than Mrs. May can provide?
What we've seen in terms of the FOCAC is this is, of course, an opportunity to focus on the pledges that are made, but it doesn't by any means suggest that there isn't the room for other trade partners to play an important role. If we look particularly to English-speaking countries in Africa, looking at countries where they can boost their services trade, the UK would be a very natural partner.
Obviously, Britain leaving the EU next March. Is it panic stations now for Britain? Is that why Mrs. May is reaching out to Africa?
Not so much a sense of panic as a sense of what needs to be done, what needs to be secured in terms of trade relationships for the medium term. This creates more certainty, hopefully also in terms of Africa's private sector and the opportunities that can be looked to there.
Razia Khan, always great to have you on Focus on Africa, and hope you come back very soon. Thank you very much. Okay. Now, let's take a quick look at other stories making the headlines across Africa and the rest of the world now. Somalia's President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo has announced plans to reopen Mogadishu Stadium. He's met the African Union peacekeeping mission, which officially handed over the stadium they had been occupying since 2011, when Al-Shabaab militants were pushed out of the city. Uganda's former Inspector General of Police, General Kale Kayihura, has been granted bail, allowing him to leave detention for the first time in nearly 80 days. General Kayihura is charged with aiding and abetting the kidnapping and illegal repatriation of Rwandans between 2012 and 2016. He denies all charges. South Sudanese rebel leader Riek Machar and other rebel groups have refused to sign the latest draft of a peace deal aimed at ending 5 years of civil war. President Salva Kiir and Mr. Machar, his former deputy, signed a ceasefire in June and a power-sharing agreement last month, but the details of a final deal are still being agreed upon.